Okay, so you know that feeling, right?
Yeah.
Where you're like really trying to understand something,
Mm-hmm.
something complex and you want to really grasp it.
Yeah.
But going through like tons of articles and studies just feels
It's a lot.
overwhelming.
Yeah, it can be a lot.
That's what we do here, right?
Yeah.
We dive into that stuff.
We do the deep dive.
So you don't have to.
Exactly.
And we try to make it, understandable and engaging.
Yeah, we bring back those key insights.
Exactly.
And help connect the dots.
Yeah.
In a way that's fun and,
Yeah, hopefully it sticks.
Yeah.
So today
Today we're going deep into economic governance.
ooh,
Which,
it sounds dry.
it might sound dry, but it's really fascinating.
I think so.
We've been absorbed in this book called Democratizing Economic Governance.
Catchy title.
I know, right?
Very catchy.
And it's got us thinking about, how economies are structured.
Yeah.
And more importantly, who's really calling the shots?
Yeah, it's not just like, government policy.
Oh, no.
It's like how industries themselves are organized.
Exactly.
Like, think about it. Why do we have these like huge companies
Right.
with like all these levels and bosses and stuff?
Yeah, why all the hierarchy?
Yeah, why isn't it just everyone like doing their own thing?
Right.
Like a level playing field of,
Yeah, just independent businesses all competing.
Exactly.
But that's not really how it works, is it?
No, it's not. And this book really digs into that.
It does.
That kind of like tension between
Yeah.
the top-down control
Mhm.
and what the, majority of the people involved actually want.
The collective will of the businesses.
Yeah. So what we're aiming to do today
Yeah, our mission today
is to figure out how.
is to untangle how these different approaches to organization,
Okay.
these governance structures,
Yeah.
how they actually impact what happens in the economy.
The outcomes.
Yeah. And we're particularly interested in this idea of social capital and whether it can help create economic systems that are more
Fair.
fairer, more equitable for everyone involved.
Yeah, for everyone.
Not just those at the top.
Right from the get-go.
Yeah, right away.
This book throws out this idea
Yeah.
of strategic failure,
It's a powerful idea.
which sounds kind of dramatic.
It does.
But what it basically means is...
It means that when a small group of powerful people
Okay.
make all the decisions,
Yeah.
the needs and aspirations of everyone else,
Right.
the businesses,
Mm.
the individuals
Yeah.
get ignored.
That makes sense.
And that's what they call strategic failure.
Okay, so before we even get into like
Yeah.
the nitty-gritty,
Yeah.
why do we even need this economic governance thing anyway?
Right. Like, why not just let the free market do its thing?
Exactly.
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the book brings in some serious thinkers to tackle it.
Okay, like...
Like Perot,
Okay.
Selznick,
Yeah.
Moe,
Mm-hmm.
Cowling, and Tomlinson.
Okay, so these are like the heavy hitters.
Yeah, these are the folks who really laid the groundwork
Okay,
for understanding why we have these companies,
right.
these hierarchies.
Instead of just everyone doing their own thing.
Exactly.
Okay, so what are like the main arguments for this kind of setup?
Well, two big theories help explain it.
Hit me.
Agency theory
All right.
and transaction cost theory.
Okay, break those down for me.
So agency theory, it's all about the potential conflicts
That
come up when you have someone acting on behalf of someone else.
Okay, so like a CEO and the shareholders.
Exactly. Their
Yeah.
goals might not always be the same, right?
Right, like the CEO might be all about taking risks
Yeah.
to boost short-term profits.
Right.
But the shareholders might be more interested in like...
Long-term stability.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that can create like friction.
Yeah, definitely friction and inefficiencies.
Okay, what about this transaction cost thing?
So transaction cost theory, it was really developed by Williamson,
Okay.
and it's all about the costs involved in doing business in the open market.
Okay.
Like, imagine having to negotiate a new contract
Yeah.
for every single transaction.
That would be a nightmare.
It would be a nightmare, right?
Yeah.
So transaction costs include things like
Like what?
the risk of people being opportunistic, meaning they're only looking out for themselves,
Oh, okay.
even if it screws over everyone else.
Right.
And then there's moral hazard.
Okay, I've heard of that.
Yeah, where someone takes a huge risk
Yeah.
knowing that someone else will have to pay if things go wrong.
Like the 2008 financial crisis?
Exactly.
Oh.
And then there's adverse selection,
Okay.
where you just don't have enough information about who you're dealing with.
Ooh, shady.
Yeah, it can get shady.
Okay, so the argument is that
The argument is that by having a company with
Yeah.
its own internal rules
Yeah.
and oversight,
Yeah.
you can actually lower these costs
Well-
because you're not constantly having to negotiate new deals.
Right. You've got like a system in place.
Exactly. You've got a system, a hierarchy to manage all these transactions.
So it's almost like companies are
Yeah.
these little islands of like,
Control
yeah,
in this sea of market chaos.
exactly.
And Toast actually said this back in 1937.
Wow. He was ahead of his time.
He was a brilliant guy.
Okay.
He said that firms exist as hierarchies
Uh-huh.
because it's cheaper to run a company
Yeah.
than it is to constantly be making new contracts in the open market.
So it's like an efficiency thing.
Exactly.
Okay, so that kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
But then there's this whole debate about
Yeah.
government intervention
Right.
versus like free markets.
It's a classic debate.
Yeah. How does that fit into this whole picture?
Well, when we zoom out and look at how entire industries are organized
Yeah.
at a national level,
Uh-huh.
this debate becomes really important.
Okay.
You've got people who argue for government interventionism,
Okay.
where governments actively get involved
Uh-huh.
in supporting and regulating and sometimes even owning industries.
Wow.
They use tools like import substitution,
Uh-huh.
strategic planning subsidies.
Okay.
Thinkers like Roderick Westphal, Pack, and Sagi, they've all written about this.
Okay.
And the idea is that sometimes the market on its own
Yeah.
can't achieve certain goals,
Like what?
like making sure knowledge spreads throughout an industry
Okay.
or solving coordination problems.
We're like, one company can't do it alone.
Right, exactly.
Oh, okay.
Or nurturing new industries until they're strong enough to compete globally.
Okay.
So that's the case for intervention.
Okay. And the other side is like the free market folks.
Exactly.
Less government, more competition.
Right. Let
Yeah.
the invisible hand do its thing.
Exactly. But the book makes this really interesting point.
Yeah.
It says that even in like super free markets,
Yeah.
these giant corporations,
For multinationals?
yeah, they can create their own kind of hierarchies and control.
Oh, absolutely.
That's almost like government intervention.
It's like a shadow government almost.
Right. And researchers like Kitson and Mazzucato have pointed this out.
They have.
So it's like whether it's like an official government bureaucracy
Right.
or a massive company calling the shots,
Yeah.
you can still end up with this situation.
Where a small group at the top is making all the decisions.
Exactly. And that brings us back to,
The book's main point.
yeah, that we need to make sure everyone has a voice.
That everyone has a say in how things are run,
Yeah.
not just the elites.
Okay. So we've talked about why we have economic organization
Yeah.
and the potential downsides of both government-led
Uh-huh.
and corporation-led hierarchies.
Right.
Now the book introduces this thing called the strategic choice framework.
Yeah. It's a way of analyzing how decisions are made.
Okay, so what's the main idea behind that?
The core idea is this concept of strategic failure.
Okay, we touched on that before,
We did.
but let's dig deeper.
Okay, so Cowling and Sugden and Heimer, they all talk about this.
Uh-huh.
And they say that strategic failure happens when the desires, the ambitions,
Yeah.
and importantly, the knowledge of the majority of people, especially in the business world, are ignored
Wow.
when policies are being made
Right.
that affect their livelihoods.
And the book really emphasizes this point,
Yeah, it does.
that it's not necessarily about bad people
no,
making bad decisions.
not always.
It's more about a disconnect
yeah.
between the people at the top making the calls.
Uh-huh. And the people on the ground who have to live with the consequences.
Right, like if you're a CEO in some fancy skyscraper,
Yeah.
you might not fully grasp the reality.
Of what it's like for the workers in the factory.
Or for the customers who are buying your product.
Exactly.
And this idea comes up a lot in Bailey's work, too,
It does.
that it's not just government-controlled economies
Right.
that can have this problem,
It can happen in free markets, too.
especially if they're dominated by these huge corporations.
Absolutely.
So what are the actual consequences of this strategic failure, then?
The book argues that it can lead to some pretty serious problems,
Like
like
how?
poorly designed governance structures, uneven economic development,
Meaning...
meaning some areas benefit way more than others,
Okay.
a distortion of international trade,
Uh-huh.
lower levels of innovation.
That makes sense if people aren't being heard.
Right, their ideas aren't being tapped into, and overall, a kind of stifling of people's capabilities. It's like they're not able to achieve their full potential.
Because they're not part of the decision-making process.
Exactly.
So this strategic failure thing, it's not just like a theoretical concept.
Well, no.
It has real-world impacts.
Absolutely.
Could you give us some, like, concrete examples of this in action?
Sure. The book gives several examples.
Right.
Like, imagine a company where the executives make decisions
Uh-huh.
that screw over their customers or their workers
Yeah.
without even bothering to ask for their input.
That happens all the time.
It does, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Or think about how decisions made by financial institutions in places like London or New York can have devastating consequences for developing countries.
Right.
The book also talks about Ghana's cocoa industry,
Okay.
where the policies of the regulator Cocoa Board can have a huge impact on the livelihoods of small cocoa farmers.
But those farmers don't really have much say.
Not really, no.
So in all these cases, the people who are most affected by the decisions don't really have a voice.
Exactly. They're excluded from the process.
So the book also talks about ways to address this.
It does.
The strategic failure.
Yeah.
What are some of the solutions that have been proposed?
There are some really interesting ideas out there.
Okay.
One idea is to create public creativity forums.
Okay. What are those?
Basically, there's spaces for people to come together and share their ideas about economic development.
Okay.
Sacchetti and Sugden, they're big proponents of this.
Okay.
And the idea is that these forums could help empower people to have more influence in their industries and their regions.
Okay, that makes sense.
Another idea is to explore alternative models of ownership and control.
Like what?
Like worker cooperatives or community-owned businesses. Branston and some other researchers have done a lot of work on this.
Okay.
And the idea is to give people a more direct say.
In how businesses are run?
Exactly. Then there's the idea of fostering non-hierarchical production models.
Okay, give me an example.
Like industrial districts or clusters.
Okay.
Where businesses collaborate more horizontally.
Instead of like top down.
Exactly.
Okay.
Cowling and Sugden have written a lot about this.
Okay.
And then there's even the idea of national planning.
Okay.
Which Heimer proposed as a way to counterbalance the power of these huge multinational corporations.
Okay, so that's like a more government-led approach.
Yeah.
Okay.
So there are lots of ideas out there.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
But the book notes that so far, none of these solutions have really transformed the way things work.
So hierarchies are still the norm?
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay, so why do you think that is?
Well, hierarchies can be very efficient. Okay.
They can be good at coordinating complex tasks.
Yeah.
And they can provide a clear chain of command.
Yeah. But we've seen that they can also lead to problems.
Absolutely.
Like this strategic failure.
Right.
Where the people at the bottom get ignored.
And the book emphasizes that this can happen at all levels.
Yeah.
Meaning within individual companies.
Yeah.
Within transnational corporations. And within governments themselves.
So it's not just a problem with, like, one type of organization.
No, it's a systemic problem.
Okay, so let's dig a little deeper into how this power dynamic plays out within firms and these massive transnational corporations.
So as we discussed earlier with COs, firms often involve relationships of power and control.
Right, like the boss has power over the workers.
Exactly.
Okay.
And when companies expand across borders and become transnational corporations, they often do so to maintain control in those new markets.
Yeah. Heimer, Chandler, and Redlick and Patelis, they've all written about this.
Okay.
And Cowling and Sugden, they define the modern corporation as basically a center for making strategic decisions.
Okay.
And it sits at the top of a hierarchical system.
Right, so the structure itself.
It's hierarchical from the ground up.
Okay, and this hierarchy becomes even more pronounced with these transnational corporations.
Oh, absolutely. Right, like umpires.
And Heimer, he used this great metaphor to describe this.
The skyscraper metaphor?
Yeah, I love that one.
It's so vivid.
Tell me about it.
So he imagined the local factory manager as being on like the lower floors of the skyscraper.
Okay.
The national corporation president, higher up.
Yeah.
But the managers of these global corporations, they're operating from the very top.
The penthouse suite.
Exactly. They have this incredible global reach.
Yeah.
But they're also really far removed
from the day-to-day reality
of the people on the ground.
Yeah, so this distance
creates problems, both within the corporation itself and in the countries where it operates.
Give me some examples.
So internally, it can limit the opportunities for people from the host countries, meaning the countries where the corporation is operating but not headquartered.
Okay.
It can limit their opportunities to rise to the top.
Yeah.
Because the top positions are often held
by people from the headquarters country.
Exactly. And this can create problems with incentives and with local knowledge.
Such as people at the top.
might not understand the nuances of the local market now externally because these subsidiaries of transnational corporations are often the biggest businesses in their host countries.
Yeah.
Their executives have a lot of power.
Locally.
But their authority is ultimately limited.
By the headquarters.
Exactly.
Okay.
Sugden and Wilson argue that these external criteria for development
imposed by the parent company can actually constrain local thinking.
They can limit the choices available to the host country.
And this can lead to what they call a branch plant outlook.
Right, where the subsidiary just focuses on
implementing the headquarters decisions without really considering the local context.
And this can affect not just economic decisions,
but also government policy and even education.
Right, the whole system can get skewed.
So, again, we see this strategic failure
emerging from the hierarchical structure
of these corporations.
Yeah.
Now, the book also makes the point that governments can exhibit these same hierarchical structures.
Absolutely.
Into similar problems.
Right. Even Heimer's solution of national planning could just end up replacing one elite
with another.
Exactly. If governments are structured in a top-down way.
Yeah.
If you have centralized bureaucracies making decisions for entire industries without any real participation.
It's the same problem all over again.
Exactly. You can still have underdevelopment and the stifling of aspirations.
And the book uses the example of Japan's MITI to illustrate this.
Right. MITI, the Ministry of International Trade and Industry.
Tell me about that.
So MITI is often seen as a success story of government industrial policy. But the book, drawing on the work of Ozawa Bailey and Okamoto, points out that there were some downsides too.
Like what?
So Japan went through this prolonged economic recession.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
It was called the Japanese disease.
Oh, wow.
And Ozawa argued that this was partly due to
too much government intervention.
Yeah. MITI initially played a crucial role in supporting high-tech firms.
After World War II.
Right. They helped Japan become a global economic powerhouse.
Okay.
But MIT also supported less efficient domestically focused firms that became heavily reliant on government support. And over time, the top firms developed very close relationships with MITI officials.
Oh, so they could influence policy.
Exactly. So even with good intentions.
A centralized structure can be vulnerable to by powerful interests.
Exactly.
And that could lead to its own form of strategic failure.
Right, because the needs of the majority are ignored.
Okay, so the book's main takeaway from the MITI case is
that the problem wasn't just specific policy errors,
but also the system itself.
Right, a centrally controlled system.
That lacked participation.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've established that hierarchical economic governance can have these negative consequences, especially this strategic failure thing.
Right.
Now the book shifts gears and starts talking about potential solutions, particularly this idea of social capital and trust institutions.
This is where things start to get really interesting.
Yeah, it sounds promising.
It is.
So where does this part of the discussion begin?
It starts by going back to the roots, to the fundamental theory of participation.
Okay.
And it brings in thinkers like Rousseau.
Oh, wow. Way back.
Yeah, Rousseau, he had this idea of the general will.
The general will.
Okay. Yeah. The idea that when citizens come together to make decisions, they do so with the public good in mind.
Okay.
Not just their own selfish interests.
So to get a collective spirit.
Exactly. And this connects to the concept of mental proximity, which means that
when people participate,
they become more aware
of others' needs.
Exactly.
Okay.
So if you're actively involved in a decision, that affects your community. You're more likely to understand your neighbor's perspectives.
And support solutions that benefit everyone.
Exactly.
Okay. So participation isn't just about voting.
No.
It's about, like, a deeper level of engagement.
Yeah, it's about understanding each other.
Okay.
And working together.
Now, the book outlines different types of participation.
It does.
Drawing on Pretty's framework.
Yeah. It identified a whole spectrum.
Oh, wow.
Of participation.
Yep.
Ranging from manipulative participation, where people are just being used, to self-mobilization.
Okay.
Where people take initiative and act independently.
So it's like a ladder.
It is.
With different levels of involvement.
Yeah.
And the book also mentions Arnstein's ladder of citizen participation.
Right, which is another way of looking at
the different levels of engagement.
Exactly.
Okay, so there's a lot of nuance to this whole participation thing.
There is.
It's not just a simple yes or no.
Right.
It's like a spectrum.
Exactly.
Now, what are some of the reasons why people choose to participate?
Well, it's not always about personal gain.
Right.
The book digs into the motivations that go beyond that.
Okay.
And it looks at research on things like volunteering, community involvement, and social movements.
Okay, so like, why do people volunteer?
Well, McEwen and Jacobson Darcy, they suggest that people volunteer to express their values, to learn new skills, to connect with others, or to boost their self-esteem.
Okay, so it's like a mix of altruism and self-interest.
Exactly.
Okay.
And Batson and other researchers, they've found that people might get involved in community activities to improve their own well-being, to help others, or to uphold their moral principles.
Okay.
And when it comes to social movements, Clanderman's points to the desire for social change, a sense of belonging, or finding meaning in life.
So it's like a complex mix of motivations.
It is.
Yeah.
People are complicated.
They are.
Now, the book emphasizes this link between participation and social capital.
Okay, so remind me, what is social capital again?
It's basically the goodwill that comes from social relationships. And that can be used to make things happen.
Okay.
Coffin Gay, they emphasize that social capital involves dense networks and strong norms of trust and reciprocity.
Okay.
So it's like a web of connections that helps people work together.
Okay, so how does this relate to participation?
Well, the book argues that
social relationships can both lead to
and be strengthened by participation.
Okay, so it's like a two-way street.
Exactly. Okay. Like Lake and Huckfelt, they found that strong social capital actually increases political participation.
Interesting.
And Krishna's work in India showed that social capital and strong institutions
work together
to encourage people to get involved.
Okay.
And Putnam famously argued that the level of social capital in a community
can determine whether people are engaged
or feel alienated. So it's really important.
Okay, and then the book brings in Olson's ideas about the logic of membership
and the logic of influence
in the context of industry associations.
Right.
Okay, so break that down for me.
So Olson argued that people or companies might join industry associations for two main reasons.
Okay, what are they?
One is the logic of membership, which is about how inclusive the association is.
Okay, so do they feel like they belong?
Exactly.
Okay.
And the other is the logic of influence, which is about how much power the association has
to achieve its goals.
Right. Okay. And Tomlinson points out that these two logics can sometimes be in conflict.
Okay, how so?
Well, larger companies, they might be more drawn to associations with a lot of influence.
They want to get things done.
Exactly. While smaller players might prioritize inclusivity.
They want to make sure their voices are heard.
Right. So it's a balancing act for these associations.
Now, we often think of democracy as a way to increase participation.
Right.
Does the book see it the same way?
Well, democracy is definitely seen as a potential solution to the problems of hierarchy.
Right.
The book acknowledges that there's growing support for more democratic structures.
At the local level.
Exactly.
Okay.
But it also points out that representative democracy, with its focus on elections, might not actually lead to more participation. In day-to-day decision-making.
Right, you vote once every few years.
Exactly. And then you might not be involved again.
Until the next election.
Right. And this goes back to Downes's work.
Okay.
He argued that representative democracy could actually create new hierarchies.
Because you have these elected officials who then have power over everyone else.
Exactly.
Okay, so if traditional democracy has its limitations, what other approaches does the book explore?
One promising direction: host speaker.